I think it surprises a lot of them because they feel that they're very upper body dominant in their training. I think they think this should be an easy test, but when they do it, they really, really struggle on it. And there's a massive power deterioration between sprint 1 and sprint 2 at times. I mean, they just can't hold it.
With endurance runners, what we see is very little difference between max power and minimum power. Whereas in somebody like a rugby player, we'll see a huge difference between max power and minimum power.
The thing that most coaches are missing when it comes to combat athletes is recovery. The recovery is everything. The ability to recover in that 160-second recovery point is the difference between winning and losing at the high end.
So perhaps we should be taking a more kinetic approach to it and considering it more like rate of force development, rate of force loss. So what's the slope of the curves? How quickly are they generating the force? How quickly are we dissipating the force?
Not a lot of people train it this way, and in boxing it's terrible. They think ladder drills and jumping in at tires is building energy systems, but it's not, because it all comes back to fundamental physiology.
For some reason, athletes seem to think power is the key to all sports performance. It's endurance that's the key to performance. Endurance is the thing that underpins everything. Power is like the glazing, but the icing on the cake. The endurance underpins it all.
All right, John and Andrew, we're on the podcast. How you doing, guys?
Doing good.
Okay, it's good to have you both on today. So, Andrew, you're a returning guest, so I encourage people to go see your previous episodes. You'll give a brief intro of yourself in a second, but John, the floor is yours. Tell us about who you are and what you do.
I'm John Babraj. I'm senior lecturer at Abertay University in Dundee. My PhD was in protein metabolism in response to nutrition and exercise, particularly looking at extracellular matrix proteins. Since then, I've gone on to really explore sprint interval training, short sprints as a training modality, almost trying to how little work you can do to maximize the benefits, both for performance and health. I've been researching that for 15 years.
Well, that's good. You're the man for the job. We're going to talk about sprints and Wingates a bunch today on many different points of view. Andrew, give us a quick, I guess, an update, because your status or situation has changed slightly since I had you on last year.
Yeah, so I'm obviously still the owner of Evolve Performance, where we kind of work with a range of athletes in different modalities, but probably most, I guess, commonly known for professional boxing, like Hannah Rankin and a few other world champions. I am now, this is like show and tell for me today. So I am now doing my PhD at Abertay University, looking at the underpinning physiology of professional boxing, looking at nerves and moxie. And John is my PhD supervisor. So it's a bit of a show and tell.
You guys are a bit of a team. So it's good to have you both on to talk about those. John, Andrew, you've been talking to me about the Wingate testing you've been doing with your fighters, and it's really interesting. And maybe what I want to do here, and John, you can take that away. I want to start with maybe some definitions, just so that everybody's clear on what we're talking about. So, John, can you tell us what sprint interval training means in the scientific literature, so that everybody's on the same page? And then talk about the Wingate itself as a protocol. Why is it named Wingate? And then what is it and how does it work? And then we'll take it from there.
Okay. So by sprint interval training, what we're really talking about is very short duration intervals. Typically, the scientific definition now is less than 30 seconds or less duration.
Yeah, 10 to 30 or something like that.
It can go down as low as 6. So
okay.
6 to 30 seconds generally is what it is. Made up of a number of repeated intervals between 4 and 10 to 20 intervals, depending on what protocols you look at. It's all based off Wingate. So Wingate was developed in a long time ago now by the Israeli army, I think it was, in the 1970s, as a fitness test to measure anaerobic performance. There's been a lot of research on the Wingate, what it actually measures. There's a lot of argument about whether it's a true anaerobic test or not. There's lots of evidence that there's a high aerobic component to it, especially once you go beyond 15 seconds. That's not to lessen its importance. It's a very good way of looking at how athletes utilize glycogen in a single test. But all the sprint interval literature has evolved from the Wingate test, from stuff we've done in our lab. We know whether by luck or by design, for the general population, around about the 7 to 8% mark of body weight is the ideal resistance for adaptation. And that Wingate sits at 7.5% for the general population. So it seems to be bang in where we would expect the biggest adaptations. Okay. In the elite athletes, you can push that further, but for general athletes, 7.5% seems to be optimal.
Now, you talked about resistance applied. Now, if we don't have access to a state-of-the-art bike that allows us to apply a certain amount of resistance. So, for example, I have a bike erg at home, and many other people get access to just, other exercise bikes. So is there maybe an RPM range that you might want to hit at your peak output that would represent maybe a similar resistance to that 7 to 8%? When I was doing my sprints, I found that I could best express my power on between 120 and 130 RPMs. But I was wondering if you had any insights on that on the lower body, because I know we'll talk about some upper body stuff as well after.
That's a difficult question because it depends what brake weight your bike can add to the flywheel that you turn. So on some bikes, 120 won't be anywhere near Wingate. The brake weight won't be enough to make that. What we've actually found is that in terms of demand, very similar to sprinting up a 10% gradient for 30 seconds. A true 10% gradient with no deviation gives a similar oxidative demand as a Wingate test. So for most, the speed that people get up to when they do Wingate varies. So we've had professional rugby players who will hit 180, 190 RPM at 8% body weight. Whereas an endurance runner might only hit 110 RPM. But the profile of the test is very different for the different sports. So the rugby player will produce a lot of rapid power, but will fade really quickly. Whereas the endurance athlete will not produce a lot of rapid power, but will sustain that 110 for the whole 30 seconds. So it's a very different profile that you get, which reflects the type of training people have been doing, really.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a clear RPM that you could say this is what it should feel like.
Right, that makes sense. Andrew, you've been using those protocols now for a while, both lower body and upper body with your fighters, if I'm not mistaken. So talk a little bit about, because the upper body, I heard about Wingate before, but mostly on the lower body. So talk about the upper body Wingate, I guess, test first, because I guess one of the particularities is that it's a testing protocol and it's a training intervention as well. So which makes it quite interesting. So Andrew, talk about that upper body component that you've been exploring recently.
So the lower and the upper are both part of the research project, and really the upper is John's madness, because none of the participants particularly enjoy this test. So the upper is just a hand crank, but it's 5% of body weight, and it's like it's the same thing as the lower. So it's a 30-second all-out sprint, and it's probably more relevant to combat sports than probably a lot of the other sports, purely because we've never really measured the upper body demand and capacity over 30 seconds. And then if you start to look at it from the point of view of how long does a combination last in, say, a kickboxing fight or a boxing fight, and you look at those short, fast durations, we're looking to see is there a nice correlation there. But from a training adaptation point of view, how do you train the upper body to have that sense of demand and work over time and drill kind of resistance and neuromuscular fatigue? It's very difficult. From like shoulder pressing doesn't do it, landmine pressing doesn't do it, all the pet hates that I have don't do it. Battle ropes, I don't think do it either. So I think the closest thing we have found has been the upper body Wingate, and we've got some pretty interesting data on that. I mean, one of the fascinations for us, I guess, is that combat athletes come into the lab time and time again and show that they have more power in their arms and their legs, which is kind of crazy when you think really that the power should be coming from the ground up. But I think we can substantially probably now say that seems to be a common trait. And we're talking everything from a relatively new start career boxer, so maybe 2 or 3 professional bouts, right up to undisputed world level. So we're seeing the same data right across the spectrum. And that is pretty fascinating. And the upper Wingate test is the vomit inducer. I mean, we've had some spectacular vomits from that, because that's the one that kills them, which is, I think it surprises a lot of them because they feel that they're very upper body dominant in their training. I think they think this should be an easy test, but when they do it, they really, really struggle on it. And there's a massive power deterioration between sprint 1 and sprint 2 at times. I mean, they just can't hold it, which is interesting. But I don't know if John wants to talk about our strange finding yet or not, or upper lower body exaggeration, because that's pretty fascinating.
Well, we'll go into findings after, so keep that one for just afterwards. I want to talk protocol a little bit. And John, you mentioned the number of repetitions that are usually used in training as a training intervention, as I can imagine. Let's talk about testing versus training using the Wingate protocol. So when would you want to use a Wingate test, and what metrics are we going to be looking at? And then from there, how can we apply it in a training setting as an intervention for an athlete? So maybe John, take the first part, and then Andrew, you can talk about the different protocols you guys have been using as training interventions on lower and upper body as well.
So typically Wingate's used as our gold standard test of anaerobic performance. So you would use it with any athlete where you have a high anaerobic, you expect to have a high anaerobic component in it. So it's routinely used in team sports, basketball, football, or soccer, depending on what you want to call it, rugby. All these intermittent nature sports have embraced the Wingate quite a lot because there's a demand for high intensity movements followed by recovery. So the Wingate allows you to assess that ability to generate that rapid power, both the phosphocreatine utilization, which will occur within about the first 5 seconds of a Wingate test, and then switching over to anaerobic glycolysis and looking at how well they're utilizing glycogen in that short period of time. Generally, the things that are looked at are the peak power, which reflects the phosphocreatine utilization. So the higher the peak power, the quicker the athlete's able to utilize phosphocreatine to maintain ATP maintenance. And then the average power is looked at as a surrogate marker of glycogen utilization. So the higher the average power, the greater the glycogen contribution to the Wingate test.
Have you seen correlations between average power and lactate measurements, for example, in people you might have tested in the past? I know you don't use lactate currently on those tests, but have you seen that in the literature or in your research?
We've seen there's been a long-standing correlation between 100-meter sprint performance running and level of blood lactate at the end. So the greater your blood lactate levels are at the end of the sprint, the more power, the faster you've generally ran it. I haven't seen anybody looking at correlations with lactate and Wingate, but we know that 1 30-second Wingate from work by Bogdanas and Bubis way back in the 1980s pretty much depletes glycogen completely within the muscle. If you do a second 30-second Wingate, the glycogen contribution is very small.
Interesting.
So you've almost got about 90% glycogen utilization in that 30-second sprint. So we know it truly is a test of glycogen metabolism. But there's nobody's really looked at I can't think off the top of my head any papers that have looked at a correlation between. But in normal sprint performance, there's a strong
It
correlation.
does. Yeah. Okay. So that would all kind of point in the same direction. So you said peak power. We look at average power as well. Any other metrics that we're interested in on a Wingate test?
I am interested in minimum power, but most people ignore that because I think minimum power reflects the aerobic component quite well of the Wingate test. But most people aren't looking at it. And again, with endurance runners, what we see is very little difference between max power and minimum power. Whereas in somebody like a rugby player, we'll see a huge difference between max power and minimum power, which I think potentially offers the opportunity for the coach to look at how well somebody will be able to repeat a Wingate. So that minimum power is really, that power difference is really great. Generally, the second sprint will be worse because they're not recovering very well because they don't have the aerobic power to recover. So I think there's things that we should look at that we don't.
Yeah.
But typically the things that are looked at are peak power and minimum power. Since working with Andrew, the addition of the Moxie monitors into a Wingate test is eye-opening.
Yeah.
As what's going on. It's offering a new insight around oxygenation of the muscle during that test, and I think there's some exciting stuff to come from that.
Yeah, I mean, we've got some pretty interesting data on that. I mean, it's interesting because you think about this whole idea of peak power and then how much power can you hold, and the kind of the difference between sprints, the drop off, saturation level, the slope of change, the resaturation values. You know, because we're very much like a lot of Wingate, we're very big into the whole systemic whole body kind of perception of what's occurring. But when you actually look at things, especially on the load bike, if you're using a nice load bike or a walk bike, I guess to an extent, and you start looking at the symmetry of sides left and right, and you look at the amount of power that's being generated by left and right, and you compare that to the level of desaturation and say the rec femur vastus lateralis, you see a completely different picture. So you start to see a much more localized view of what's occurring, which interests me more than probably the systemic approach. So which is why I'm probably less interested in lactate, because I think there's enough out there to show that we're going to see, you know, increases here, increases there. But I think what's more interesting in is why does one leg outperform the other leg from a point of view of utilization, and why does one leg recover less than the other leg? And there's just a whole heap of interesting things occurring on these sprints that are pretty they're pretty eye-opening, but they're quite short and they're quite difficult at the same time to analyze, because you know yourself, Sean, that the Moxie's just giving you this arbitrary number. You really then got to dive into the kinetics of what's actually taking place in the muscle tissue and try to then explain what's actually occurring from a kind of, you know, an oxygen uptake and how does that relate to phosphocreatine and all that stuff. And it's very, very exciting times for us in the labs. I think we'll produce some, hopefully get a couple of nice papers out of this because we'll get some pretty interesting data on it. But I think Wingate on its own is a great test. It can be a great training protocol, but I think slap on some Moxies everywhere, you know, and you can never have enough Moxie. Because you know, because you've got loads of them, Sean. So, but I think we're starting to see a deeper understanding of what's taking place, you know, rather than, you know, especially with these boxers, because you start to see these really interesting asymmetrical issues. You know, like some people have very nice pedal efficiency scores, even their biomechanics, their cycling is very good. Some have very horrific asymmetrical issues, but they're producing more power. So that begs the question on mechanical efficiency as well, and how does that, what role does that really have in place with these test protocols? So there's a lot more there than meets the eye with them when you start playing with Moxie and look at oxygen kinetics and heart rate kinetics. And the correlation between two of them is quite fascinating as well.
And as far as you can talk about it from a research standpoint, of course, don't say what you're not allowed to say. But we talked about, John, you mentioned a few metrics that are usually looked at. You also said there were things that should be looked at but are not. So John, from your point of view, what should be looked at in addition to those? And then Andrew, let's talk a little bit about what might be interesting to look at from a Moxie perspective on those Wingate tests.
So for me, the Wingate offers an opportunity to look at endurance differently, almost like localized endurance within the muscle. And I think that gets ignored because everyone views it as an anaerobic only test. So I think we're missing a trick there. So that minimum power, and perhaps even we need to delve more in, and especially when you've got bikes like the Loader, you can start delving more into slope of change. So take a more kinetic approach to what's happening. What we're doing at the moment is taking a static approach. We're doing this 30-second exercise, and all we're looking at is an average number. So the peak power is a 5-second average. The average power is a 30-second average. But the curve's not flat, it's up and down. So perhaps we should be taking a more kinetic approach to it and considering it more like rate of force development, rate of force loss. So what's the slope of the curves? How quickly is that how quickly are they generating the force? How quickly are we dissipating the force? And that might tell us a lot more about our athletes than simply that static measure of this is peak power, this is average power.
Are those metrics used anywhere else in sports science? So it's almost like introducing a new array of metrics that we should be looking at, or from a conceptual standpoint and from a practical standpoint as well.
Yeah. Rate of force development will be looked at a little bit with
plyometrics, I guess, and
jump height with if you have a decent force platform, that will give you that rate of development. Or with some like a isokinetic dynamometer, where you're doing that isometric movement and you've got the static contraction, but you get an increase in force production in the muscle. That's typically where rate of force development is looked at. And perhaps we should be taking that and going, right, we've got this movement model now. We've got this high peak power development and then loss. And we should be sort of applying kinetic principles to it. But I don't think anyone's looking at it in that way at all.
I mean, the kinetics is really the interesting bit for me, because you can take the Wingate, you can take those two back-to-back trials, and you can see peak, meaning you look at your average, your conventional things. But then when you actually look at the kinetics, the slow and fast rates of change, and changes growth and decay, then you see a completely different picture. And then when you start seeing over multiple sprints, you start to see how someone's actually capable of holding power, what the dissipation rate is, what the recovery rate is. And I think we're missing tricks also on a deeper understanding of recovery between sprints and just how much rate of force development can be regenerated back up. So I think there's a massive amount of Wingate work that's just still waiting to be done. And, we've just touched on some of it, and there's a massive amount more of it. And it's quite exciting. When you start looking at rate of change, it's quite fascinating between athletes, between weight classes, between kind of gender. There's a massive amount of things out there to be looked at. We still don't really know enough about what's occurring, because John's right, it's just an anaerobic test. Even when you do your undergrad or you do a bit of postgrad, every time you see it done, it's like it's an anaerobic test, but it's not necessarily an anaerobic test when you dive right into it. There's a lot more there, and that's quite exciting. It's an absolute nightmare to analyze and look at the data and pull all that Moxie data and work at all the linear regressions and everything, John. But but there's an exciting world there of things that we don't really understand. And I know I'm probably jumping ahead a bit here, but with some of the athletes we're working with, the recovery that we're now getting in athletes is insane, absolutely insane. And it's just doing sprint protocols, but it's been able to dial in the sprint protocol based upon what we see physiologically in their testing results. And that's where we're making probably big headway, especially at the world level. It's making big gains, which is quite exciting.
That's really interesting. You talked, Andrew, you talked earlier about the protocol, the testing protocol that you use. So maybe can you describe, because I believe there's two. I guess for you guys, there's a lower, an upper, and then you repeat that, or I believe that's how you do it. So talk about the protocol in a bit more detail so that people can get a good picture of how you guys assess your fighters right now. And then again, we talked about in general, but maybe pinpoint the few things you try to look at in more detail from the results that you collect on those tests.
So in the research, we're doing pretty much just standard Wingate, 30-second 1 minute recovery and doing 2 sprints. But what we're doing is alternating it. So they're going from lower into kind of upper body. We're giving some time in the research, obviously for glycogen and that type of stuff. But but out with research, it's a little bit more brutal. So for example, and Hannah won't mind us chatting about Hannah will come in and do an incremental treadmill test. And then she'll go straight into a lower body sprint protocol. And then she'll go straight into an upper body sprint protocol, and then she'll go back through it again. And we're just really pushing just to see just what can she hold and how can she recover. I think probably the thing that most coaches are missing when it comes to combat athletes is recovery. The recovery is everything. The ability to recover in that 160-second recovery point is the difference between winning and losing at the high end. Because that recovery 60 seconds is giving you cognizance, it's giving you a whole range of things that people are not even considering. And the more you can really delve into the kinetics of that 60 seconds or what's going on and change it, the better the result for the athlete. So the protocols are not that complex. They're just very standard protocols, but we will change them up. So we may then do, so for example, Hannah goes through a changing based upon how we test her. So because obviously you have to introduce new stimulus every now and again to get adaptation, we will change the sprints up. So sometimes she will do the 31 minute, sometimes she'll do 15 30s, sometimes she'll do 10 20s, but it's not a set protocol in the sense that we don't lay out 6 weeks and go, this is what you're doing. Every week, the data is analyzed, all the kinetics are analyzed, and then we're looking at how's she recovering, what's the fast, what's the slow phases of recovery, how are they changing, and then everything's tweaked off the back of that data. That probably makes it very difficult for athletic coaches to do unless they understand kinetics and how to take Moxie data and how to take heart rate data. However, we are hopefully in project 2, when we dive into mitochondrial capacity and testing methods, we're hoping that we may be able to produce something that athletes could use as a mechanism to measure mitochondrial capacity, and then ways of training that through sprint training. That's where we're going just now, and it's looking pretty like it's going to happen. Can't believe I'm saying that. It's actually happening, John. So we've had quite a lot of trial and error with this, but it's happening really well. But I guess for me, it's everything's really about the localized view of the athlete rather than we need the systemic picture, obviously. We need to understand aerobic capacity and anaerobic capacity, but it's much more a dive into where, I guess we talk about limitations a lot from cardiopulmonary and all that type of stuff. For me, it's more muscular tissue. What's the limitation of the tissue? Why is it not uptaking oxygen? Why is it, how's it utilized? How's it recovering between bouts? How do we improve that? Because the more we can utilize muscle tissue and contract and, concentric, eccentric movements, the better the movement and the better the power generation, rate of force development. So for me, everything goes right down to basic physiology about that muscle tissue, and everything comes from there, which is why we're kind of taking this approach, and we've been quite successful with it. So that's it.
If we talk now about training with Wingate Sprints, we talked about the testing aspect. John, I fell on I didn't fall on it. I found it. Maybe Andrew, you might have sent it to me. It was a literature review on sprint interval training. I believe it was a fairly recent one. One thing that stood out to me was essentially the impact of recovery duration on the adaptations that incurred from sprint interval training. So essentially, which makes total sense. If you had 20 to, let's say, well, we keep the 10 to 30-second window, but I believe there were most of the papers that were assessed were between 20 and 30 seconds. Most of them were, I believe it was 4 to 7 sprints per session, 3 sessions a week for 2 to 6 weeks. I think it was in that range. And if you had very short recoveries between your sprints, you had more of a VO2 improvement. And then to caricature, to make it in the broad strokes. And then if you had very long rests, so we're talking 3-4 minutes between your 30-second sprints, you would have obviously more, peak power output, sprint, W prime, those kind of adaptations. So talk about those different training interventions, John, and how people might be able to apply them best.
So with sprint training, one of the key metrics for controlling what you want to get out is the recovery phase. It's probably about the only metric that's been shown to change outcomes. Duration of sprints, if you've got enough sprints, the duration of sprint doesn't matter. It doesn't really seem to affect it at all. But the work to rest ratio, how long you allow them between, does. So when you have a short recovery, what you do is you keep cardiovascular load high. So the heart rate's not coming down very fast, so you're pushing that cardiovascular load. So you get a more systemic adaptation within the respiratory system. So you're better able to deliver oxygen to the working muscle, and then coupled with the mitochondrial adaptations you get from sprint training, the muscles better able to utilize that oxygen,
Mm-hmm.
leading to the improvement in aerobic performance. It's not always seen in changes in VO2 max. In terms of studies, I would say probably 50 to 60% of sprint studies show a change in VO2 max, 40 to 50% show no change in VO2 max. But
Does it
what
depend? Sorry to cut you off. Does it depend on population as well?
VO2 max has a huge genetic component to it. So for some people, that VO2 max isn't going to change very much at all. And it just depends on who you've recruited, really. But what does change all the time is the time to exhaustion. That time that it takes to reach VO2 max increases. So regardless of whether VO2 max itself has changed, the time taken to get to VO2 max has changed. And I think that reflects more the muscular adaptation to sprint between that adaptation of mitochondria is seen constantly, but you don't always get the cardiovascular adaptation, especially in 2 to 4 weeks studies. It tends to be on the cusp of seeing it.
Okay, so you would say that you would need a longer training interventions to maybe see more of those adaptations, whereas
So, for the cardiovascular side of it, you're looking 6 weeks plus, you get consistent VO2 max changes.
Okay.
And changes in arterial
arteriovenous difference.
Arterial compliance.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So you improve arterial compliance, so you get greater vasodilation during exercise and stuff. But they are longer term adaptations. They take a bit longer to induce. In terms of frequency, you said 3 days a week. Most studies using sprints are either 3 or 2 days a week. 3 days a week versus 2 days a week when they've done the same number of sessions doesn't show any difference in adaptation. So if you did 6 sessions over 2 weeks or 6 sessions over 3 weeks, you would still get the same adaptation. And we know that you can generate some of the adaptation in once a week. It's whether that's enough of a stimulus to get full adaptation is still not known. But you don't need to do it 3 times a week. Well, it's 3 times a week is optimal. Twice a week is actually enough.
And that's important. And that's really important. The balance in the sessions is probably more key than people realize, because people are either doing too much or not enough, and they never fall in the middle, right? And it's important because when you're periodizing for an athlete, like especially a combat athlete, you have a real nice flexibility with these to get adaptations, you know, because you could squeeze in 3 different points a week, or, you know, but what the key is, obviously, what I find is intensity level has to be high in a lot of these sprints, and it's not high enough, which is why people that are doing sprint protocols are not seeing any return on investment, because they're not actually pushing hard enough. Because it's only when you take them in the lab and you actually still know what pushing hard is, do they actually realize what that actually is, you know? And a lot of that, I think, is people are very, I think they come into the lab, there's that kind of feeling it's a different environment. They have to kind of prove themselves, they push harder. Because I've seen it being in gyms, you do testing in gyms and people think they're pushing hard, and you're saying, no, you're not pushing hard enough. And they don't believe you.
I think people are intrinsically lazy.
Yes.
They take themselves to a point that's uncomfortable, but they don't like to push themselves beyond that uncomfortable point.
And that's where we need to go.
Bring them to the lab, we're in that uncomfortable point.
Yeah, and be called everything under the sun. But it is interesting. The intensity is the interesting one for me, because you get this whole thing about, oh, I couldn't do like 2 super maximal sprints a week because it would affect my immune system and compromise me. And that's not the case. You know, you can manage these pretty easy because they're small bouts. And the recovery, as long as the recovery modeling is working to your advantage, everything's fine. You can get away with quite a lot of weeks. You know, Hannah Rankin's a good example of someone that's, you know, we've seen massive changes in her recovery. You know, between rounds, she can drop to 60 to she's getting near the 70 beats per minute drop. You know, and she trains insane. She's like a Wolverine. She's just, I'm pretty sure we cut her open. She's titanium or something. She's just, and she'll tell you, because she said it in the last podcast, she hates these sessions with her vengeance, but she won't drop them now. That's the interesting thing. Although she hates them, she's just done one this morning, she won't drop them because the benefit she's seeing is just astronomical. I mean, Hannah's seen great return on investment on them. And it's going to be an interesting one as well, because Hannah was doing a lot of work in the altitude chamber, which we changed up as well. And we took her out altitude for a lot of the high intensity training. Because I suspect that if she was trying to do these sessions in altitude, she wouldn't be getting the same adaptations, which is another point. A lot of people are wanting to do protocols, but when they actually do them, are probably not doing them the way they should be doing them either. So there is a way to do them, and you have to plan them, but they are super flexible. I mean, for combat athletes, if they need to do, say, 3 sprint sessions a week, they don't necessarily need to do Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So they can play around with them. So if the schedule changes, it's pretty easy. And most gyms have a decent watt bike in them. So a lot of them have a watt bike pro, or they have the Carol bike. Is it the Carol bike? That's quite good name. And a few others as well. I think it's just slightly harder to do these type of tests on the assault bike. That's my only thing. I don't think it comes across necessarily the same. So what we do is I will make them do it with no hands on the assault bike, and just to make it a full leg component. A lot of them end up using too much upper body.
Yeah, I guess that's the difficult part with the assault bike or the echo bike, is that there's the upper body component that's gonna maybe muddy the waters on what's going on the lower body. And I also find that just having a stimuli on the lower body only makes it really interesting. I've been working with a friend of mine is coaching a local MMA fighter, and so we did some testing in January, and he's been doing some work on the bike since then. And over 8 weeks, and he wasn't doing sprints yet in those 8 weeks. He's doing them now. Don't worry. So first 8 weeks was essentially just getting a little bit of low intensity in him, because he did none of it. And just, as you know, you got to have a minimum of low intensity work to balance out all the high intensity stuff that you do. So even just from that, he's seen some really, really great returns. And now we started on some repeat sprint protocols, and he's not very happy, but we got the buy-in with the first 8 weeks and the great progress that he made. So I'm sure he'll see good returns on that second part. So you guys were talking about, or Andrew, you were talking about fitting those Wingate sprints. And so maybe talk about, we talked about the different structures with the short rests, long rest. So when would you use some longer rests, Andrew, with your athletes? When would you use some shorter rests? And how do you change that up over time so that, like you said, the stimuli is not the same, but staying in that same realm of sprint interval training?
So Sundays are data days for me. So every athlete, I analyze everything on a Sunday before the week ahead. So the strength is obviously periodized over a slightly longer period of time, but all the intervals are week by week periodized. So it's kind of, Sunday sucks because it's sitting wading through heart rate data and other data and looking at what we're seeing, and then we'll adjust the recovery point on that. Some athletes want to use HRV for recovery to determine how we're going to change the load steps. I don't do any of that. Actually, in many ways, since working with John, everything's been stripped back to quite basic things. It's really basic. It's just a case of looking at how they're recovering, what are we seeing, how they're responding in lab sessions, and then mixing up. So Hannah, for example, will come up 3 times in the camp. So at the moment, she fights May the 13th for the world title fight. She's got a title defense. So she's up, not this week, next week, 2 weeks, I think, John, she's back up. And that'll be her mid camp. And that we will then be able to compare how our sprint training has went in the last 3-4 weeks since the last visit. Mm-hmm. If I was an athletic coach, then I would probably be using heart rate, and I'd be looking at recovery points. And I guess most athletic trainers are not going to want to wade into exponential curve fitting.
I think the simple way to look at heart rate recovery is that take it a minute after the exercise. What's it down to?
60-second decrease in heart rate.
Yeah. So if you look at Hannah now on a 60-second decrease, as Andrew says, it's 70-80 beats reduction.
She's getting back down to almost starting heart rates in early rounds of sparring now. which
That's
is
crazy.
insane. Yeah. And, you know, and in the lab, she's doing way better. You know, it's you know, it's funny because I was saying to Hannah, you know, eventually we might hit a plateau, but we haven't quite hit it yet. So it's going to hit it, you know, but she does train. The other thing is as well, as it comes into mindset, she trains incredibly hard. We have other athletes that train incredibly hard, and you get the results, and they get the ones that are doing the sprints in their own time that are obviously clearly not working as hard, and you have to kind of chase them up. But the interesting thing from a combat sport point of view is they all seem to hate it, yet the sport is predicated on about high explosive movements over short durations in time.
And getting hurt.
Yeah, and getting hurt. So it's kind of funny that these hurt them the most, these sprints. But going back to like a physiological response, you know, in the research that we're doing, sprints are more closely related to sparring than pad work and bag work. So there is the cross transference is not where coaches think it is, which is probably going to make me even more disliked in the boxing community. But when we look to publish some of this, but the interesting thing is the sprints from a point of view, if you look at Moxie and you look at rapid desaturation values and change of slope, and heart rate, and you compare that right across to sparring, there's a really interesting picture there that you don't see in pad work and bag work, which is kind of interesting.
John, could we look at maybe depressed peak heart rate as a sign of fatigue as well, you know, across time, if you have enough data on an athlete? I mean, I remember I think I did my last Wingate session the day before I got sick for a few days, and I did the day before, and my heart rate would usually go up to, I think, 172 on that first 30 second. And on that session just before I got sick, so I was probably already there, but wasn't feeling it yet, I could only go to 162. And I've seen other athletes and coaches use that kind of depressed heart rate as a sign of fatigue. Is that something that you guys looked at as well?
I'm not sure if it's a sign of fatigue, but rather a sign of your muscles not contracting right, because you're having to fight off your immune system's kicked in because you've got some sort of bug. So the ability to use the muscles to generate ATP is suppressed by your central drive.
Okay.
So because your immune system's active, it's requiring ATP. So your body's stopping your muscles overutilizing ATP, if that makes sense.
All right. So it's
okay. It's a reflection of the fact that you're ill. You were
Yes.
ill in that session, even if you didn't think you were ill. There was obviously some sort of illness underlying it. So it's probably not something to be ignored. But there will be a day-to-day fluctuation in heart rate when people come in. But if it's really suppressed, then there's a sign that there's something not right.
Yeah.
But
Andrew?
it might not necessarily mean fatigue.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Andrew?
Yeah. I mean, I don't see it that often. I mean, I guess for me, I'm monitoring bag sessions, pad sessions, and sparring sessions. So for me, if there's a drop off in work rate and quality, that tends to be more what I lean towards with our athletes. Just because, as John said, we can have athletes come in and peak at 178, but may come in the fall, we can peak at 167, but the actual power output on the test may be similar, you know. So I don't buy that a 10 beat drop is necessarily going to be an overall immune system compromisation, but I think performance is the key. So if an athlete, I mean, we have a very simple rule: the athletes, if they don't feel well, they say they don't feel well, and we step down their training, because professional athletes know themselves when something's not right, because their job is to perform. So we don't have a problem. So if an athlete comes in and says, you know, I'm not feeling it today, sparring's off the table, just go straight up. We don't even take chances with it. And then we'll just put them on a recovery day. And the recovery day, they still work, but they just won't work. And things like anything that involves kind of a lot of high cognitive function, and, you know, for sparring, anything can kind of injure them or damage them, we won't do it. We used Oura rings for years, heart rate, you know, everything under the sun. And now it's just, I just go, the athlete knows. So we have a very strict policy with them. If they do not feel well, they have to inform on the coaching staff, because athletes will want to train all the time. But we're actually pretty good now. We're most all, you know, phone in sick. No. And then, but they don't actually do that often, which is good. So, but especially in world level boxing, you can't take the chance of putting someone in a spar session when they're compromised. That's just It happens, unfortunately, but it's absolutely ridiculous that it does in this day and age.
Mhm.
Yeah,
But I think generally, it's the same in the lab sessions. We won't take them in a lab session if we're not feeling too good. I mean, that's the one session we definitely wouldn't do with them, be a lab session if we're not feeling good, because that is a high physiological load on the system. So, that would be the worst. That would be the worst thing they could do, is blag their way into a lab session. Although we would know pretty quick. So
you talked about the importance of fitting it in the right spot. So say someone wants to include some sprint interval training intervention into their week. Is there a better day to do it on? Does it have to be subbed in for something else that they were doing before? Can it be added on? How do you manage those parameters?
So anything super maximal is 2 days away from any spar. We don't let them do anything super maximal near sparring. So we have sparring generally Saturdays. Weekends are good. So we don't over spar either. We're probably one of the few places that doesn't go crazy with sparring, because we want them very technically proficient on the spar day. So we will make sure that the sprints are not too close to any spar sessions. Mm-hmm. So, but they can be flexible on how they want to do them otherwise. So I have a couple that do Monday, then do Wednesday, Thursday. And then I've got some that do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. For me, it's an interesting thing at the moment about if we want an adaptation, and theoretically, could we get an adaptation over 12 sessions, say, if we're talking say, or 9 sessions? How do we accumulate those sessions? And is there any science behind when, why, and how we should accumulate those sessions? And John's probably got a better answer than I, but I feel at the moment, as long as we get these couple of sprints, these three sessions in a week, it doesn't seem to matter when they actually do them. It seems, for whatever reason, to be given the physiological adaptation that we're looking for. So there is a question on that about timing, and is it really that relevant?
I think the general rule of thumb is at least 24 hours between high intensity sessions. So you're not doing them back to back. But I think the reason for that is to allow full glycogen resynthesis, rather than anything else. So it doesn't mean you can't do them back to back. And nobody's looked at the difference between doing them 48 hours apart versus doing them back to back in terms of adaptations.
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the
with athletes, you've got to be flexible. I think is if they can cope with it back to back, and that's the time frame they want to do it in, then it should be fine. It's all about flexibility. Trying to be as flexible as possible.
From an implementation standpoint, you mentioned, John, that the duration didn't have a huge impact on adaptations as long as the work was done. Do you guys then err maybe more on the side of 20 seconds rather than 30 seconds? Because those, I guess, if those 10 extra seconds of work don't actually bring anything extra from a physiological standpoint, is it worth doing them, or is it just worth doing more reps, or can we just save that up for maybe that third session in the week rather than just 2? How do you guys see that?
I think the duration teaches a psychological lesson about pain tolerance to the athlete.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
I concur.
You can blast for it, feels bad, but you got your recovery, you get back and you go and you go and go. As you expand the sprint, there's a grind through it. And it teaches the athlete that when they think they're tired, but actually not.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important lesson to learn there. And
that is one of the amazing things about Moxie that probably it doesn't get used enough, I guess, now, kind of biofeedback kind of concept, which our athletes probably hate Moxie now as well, because you can go, now you're plenty of gas in the tank. And they go, but I'm really hurting. You're like, yeah, but you're plenty of gas in the tank. That's just your body telling you you're working hard, but you're still not reached it. And that's one of the great things about Moxie, especially when you're doing things like, incremental treadmill testing, or you're doing critical power testing. It's a really nice insight. Psychologically, it feeds back to them, and they know, because we have it in sparring now. They'll come over and they'll look at me and go, how's the gas tank? And I'll be like, yeah, doing well. You can push harder. And like, for example, we have we still do grindy watt bike sessions as well. So we do almost like our own, I guess, critical power model with the Moxie. And for combat athletes, that's the whole idea where you do 3 minutes maximal kind of wattage. We want to hold it for 3 minutes, and we're looking at the drop-offs, and that session is just a purely psychology session for me. I don't really care about the values in those ones necessarily, although they think I do, and they're probably now going to watch this and go, but I'm interested psychologically, can they push and push and push? And what we're seeing with the likes of Hannah is on those 3 minutes, her best wattage is the last minute. So she's actually improving at the last minute. She's jumping up, almost 50, 60 watts in that last minute. Psychologically, she knows she's probably getting near the end, so she can push a little bit harder. And that's what you want. So I think the interesting thing about a lot of these sprint protocols is that you're getting great physiological adaptations, but getting great psychological adaptations as well. And once they start to realize,
one of the things that athletes start to do with it is they use it as a gauge.
Yeah.
So we'll say things like, well, that felt like the 4th sprint, or that felt like the 6th sprint.
Yeah.
But I know I could have went further. I know I could have done, I can go to 8 sprints like that. So I'm well within my comfort zone, even though it's uncomfortable. So they sort of reprogram their brain about how they think their body can work.
So we had an athlete in this week who said to us that he's getting used to being, what was it? Comfortable being uncomfortable. I think that's what he put it, wasn't it? Yeah, he said to us, comfortable being uncomfortable. That's what he said to us. And we were like, excellent, you're on the road then. Because that's what, especially combat athletes, that's what it's about. Those bad times when things are not going the way you want, the game plan's maybe not happening, you can't hear your corner because of the noise. You have to ride out 3 minutes to make it to the 60-second recovery. We want them to be able to absorb the punishment, but be cognizant in the moment and know that they've been through worse. And we're very good at making them go through worse. So,
I mean, that's just, basic physical prep, if you will. The training should be harder than the competition, so that when you get to the competition, you've been there, done that. It's kind of Hell Week from the Navy SEALs comes to mind. Once you've gone through this and the 6 months before and after, whatever mission you're going to have to go on, you can get through it. And I guess the psychological component makes a lot of sense. Now, if we talk again adaptation and practicality, John, what's the minimum number of sprints that one might need to do or should do in a given session to get those benefits from sprint interval training? Do you see that 4 to 7 window being a good place to start, at least for people interested in this type of work?
Yeah, it depends on the duration of the sprint that you're doing. So obviously, what seems to be the magic number is it doesn't matter how you break the sprints up, as long as you've got at least 1 minute of work.
Okay.
So that 1 minute seems to be important.
Is that the minimum you want to reach? Yeah.
So whether it's 10 6 seconds, 6 10 seconds, 3 20 seconds, 2 30 seconds, that doesn't really matter. As long as you've got that 1 minute. And the reason for that is, and the reason why I think that's important, is glycogen depletion. That 1 minute of work completely depletes the muscle of glycogen, and that's what's driving the adaptations. So it's really important that you have as much glycogen depletion as you can possibly generate. So that 1 minute seems to be crucial. You can push it further than that, but that 1 minute's the minimum that you need.
Okay. And then from a recovery standpoint, we talked about the range of, 10-second recovery all the way to 4 minutes. So is there a better way to do it? Should there be a mix of both? Should it be periodized over time to do for a certain time short recoveries, for a certain time long recoveries?
I'm not sure is the honest answer.
It's a good one.
With the kickboxer that I worked with, he was slightly older. It was towards the end of his career, had never won anything, but had the skill set to do so, and he kept burning it because he was doing lots of resistance training and stuff, and silly weight cuts. That's another aspect of combat sports that I don't understand. So what we did with him was, when he first came in, he had a 1-to-2 work to rest ratio, just to try and push him. So 10-second sprint, 20 seconds recovery. And it used to take him about an hour to recover from those sessions. He was seeing stars, he was a little bit dizzy. When he retired, most of his sessions had a negative work to rest ratio. So if he was doing 10-second sprints, he would have 5 seconds recovery. If he was doing 30-second sprints, it would be 15 seconds recovery. But he was able to cope with that. And it meant when he went into a ring, he didn't need a lot of recovery time between thrown combinations, which then meant his work rate was much higher in the ring than anyone else. And it led him to him winning 2 world titles, the WKC and Waco, I think, at the age of, was it 36 and 37. So I think it depends what you're trying to do with the athlete. If you're wanting to increase power, expand. If you want a bit of both, 1 to 6 works well. I'll give you some of the aerobic adaptations, some of the power adaptations. But a lot of times when athletes are coming in, they've already got the power, because for some reason athletes seem to think power is the key to all sports performance. Strength is the key to performance, whereas it's endurance that's the key to performance. Endurance is the thing that underpins everything. Power is like the glazing, but the icing on the cake. The endurance underpins it all. So what I found is you actually have to work on their endurance. They've actually got sufficient power.
Right. So you're better off working on the shorter rests kind of domain, because that'll have a bigger impact on their endurance than okay, that makes sense. And then from what you're saying, then one of the goals, especially for someone, I guess, who needs more endurance, one of the goals, as you maybe alluded to it, might be to want to decrease those rest times, to condense the work over a shorter period of time. So we have that minimum minute, and then what might you push that up to realistically? And if we omit the extreme cases of kind of, these are the hardest sessions I've ever given to anybody, but 1 to 2 minutes, 1 to 3 minutes, how much? I
would probably only ever push it up to 2 minutes.
Yes.
Okay, so a safe,
really any point going beyond that. So
1 to 1.5 minute might be a kind of a safe bracket to play within over a session.
Yeah, then you get diminishing returns.
Right.
So and then you get diminishing compliance. So you have to be quite smart with how you're doing it. But you have a minute to 2 minutes of time that you can play with and break up in any way you want. And depending on someone, if you go back to boxers or kickboxers, MMA fighters, depending where they are in camp, that's pretty interesting, depending how their sparring sessions are going. So I'll often mix the sprints up based upon how the sparring went at the weekend. So if I feel there wasn't enough explosive content and there wasn't enough recovery and breakaway points from, say, striking to clinch and moving away, I will change the sprint protocol for them. So I'll increase time, and I'll do negation levels, and I'll do a whole heap of things. There's a massive amount of things you can do. I find now we have very high compliance rates for sprints, because although they know it's full out, they see the benefit. They see it transfer into the ring. And also they know that they're only going in the gym for 20 minutes. So it's an easy sell on loved ones as well. I'm just going to nip across to the gym. I'll be back in 20 minutes. You know, and people can't, I mean, we take the strength work down more than most gyms. We don't do a massive amount of strength work now. So any work we do tends to be more eccentric based. Everything we do is basically neuromuscular endurance. That's the key, because if it goes back to what John was saying there about the ability to sustain work rate can overwhelm an opponent. And 9 out of 10 times in smaller level competitions, the referee will stop the fight before it gets to knockout, especially in amateur boxing. So if an amateur boxer can overwhelm an opponent with blows and strikes and have that ability to offload that work rate, there's a higher chance of stopping the opponent without actually stopping them physically through a knockout. So that's an important skill set. And everyone has to have that. And then you have to have the other element for which is sustained massive outputs. So they have to have massive explosive combination work, be able to throw big power shots and sustain it, break away, recover. And it's all comes down to this whole idea of glycogen and how your body's utilized and how you recover from it. And not a lot of people train it this way. And in boxing, it's terrible. They think ladder drills and jumping in at tires is building energy systems, but it's not, because it all comes back to fundamental physiology, you know, and it's quite frustrating at times when you look around and you see boxers not doing particularly well, and you can pinpoint it because you see the training drills they do. They're still doing 20-mile runs. They're doing crazy ladder drills. They're doing crazy plyometric drills that don't really cross transfer over. They're being convinced that by their coach through every acronym under the sun about PAP, PIP, POP, that these are things that are doing things for them, when actually they could probably just benefit from doing some sprints. You know, 3 sprints three sprint sessions a week, 2.5 minutes of work, and they would get a much more bigger change in physique, explosive power, mitochondrial capacity. All the good stuff is there for the taking, but we still, it's crazy, you know. And sprints have been around for a long time. The whole process, football, soccer, all these other sports, you know. And I remember as a kid doing them, you know, and in football sessions, everything was sprint orientated, sprint. Yeah. But in combat sports, for whatever reason, we're still very much in the dark ages, which is
it's quite interesting. If athletes haven't done sprints before or used a bike before, the question you get is, how does that transfer across to boxing? But if you put a big old tractor tire down and give them a sledgehammer, they'll happily whack the hell out of that. But not do a cycle sprint.
And no question, they won't even question it. But it's funny, but, you know, sometimes you take the kids in the lab, right, and you forget this is maybe the first time they've been on a bike, even though it's stationary. And you always spend a lot of time getting kind of pedal crank set up and, you know, distance and all that stuff and Q angles and that stuff set up for the extension of the leg to get them to the sprint. But I think the people that come to the lab expect, and we've had very super high level world champions in, and I think they have been surprised at how badly abused they have felt after the bike sprints and the upper body sprint versus anything else they do in the lab. So we will do rate of force development, we'll do eccentric kind of and concentric force and all that stuff as well, counter movement jumps, we'll do the usual fare. And all of that seems to be quite tolerable to them. But when they come off the bike, and especially hand crank, some of them are in the fetal position. They're just like, they're like, why is this so hard? And you're like, well, but you can spend 40 minutes with a sledgehammer and a tire, but you can't give me 2 30-second sprints.
I mean, the arm crank is really interesting.
Yeah.
Given how much power they've spent generating in their arms, they really struggle with the endurance component of the arm crank.
Yeah.
To the extent where they lose form, they can't control the core anymore, and there's a whole lot of lateral movement going on.
It's a lot of Titanic sinking taking place. It's a lot of swaying. But there's that to me is probably the biggest shocker, I think, John. We've not seen anyone smash that yet. We've not had anyone in yet that I've went, wow, that was an amazing upper body Wingate test. It's been, especially from the research point of view, it's been an eye opener. Just that the sport has become so dominant in upper body strength work, but it doesn't translate into endurance. You know, and there's a big question there about, obviously, maybe there's too much oxygen utilization, therefore, and that the shoulders people and the shoulder complex is there to stabilize. It's not necessarily there to generate that amount of force that they think they're forcing. And the Moxie data on these sessions is probably amongst, and I'll tell you this, we'll put this out here because this is the most fascinating thing to me. If you do these research projects and you're going to do box, you're going to do pad work, sparring, you're going to capture all the data that you can't normally get because we can do it now with Moxie and all this stuff. And yet the two tests that are the most interesting when it comes to boxer isn't the pad work, isn't bag work, isn't sparring. It's an incremental treadmill test and an upper Wingate test. That's the two tests that are showing us the most information about boxing, which is bizarre when you think about it, because you would think it would be the sport-specific components. But what we're seeing is the sport-specific components aren't very sport-specific. That the upper Wingate and the incremental treadmill test are showing very interesting SMO2 kind of profiles. And from that, we're able to extrapolate out quite a lot of information about how that person actually performs at very high intensity, or how they don't, which is mostly the case at the moment. And I'm sure once we dig into the data, once we get the Python code running, that we'll be able to see some interesting correlations between the last 30 seconds of an incremental treadmill test versus sparring sessions versus upper Wingate. So, I mean, it's, you know, for me, it's kind of been quite fascinating that, you know, I've always been involved in sport for a very long time. I've said for a lot of years, I think a lot of what we do isn't transferable, and I've got a lot of hatred for it in the community. But I think I feel that more vindicated of late that what we're seeing is right, that a lot of things that are being done are just being done because that's the way they were done. But from a physiological point of view, the transference isn't really there, you know. And that's the crazy thing is, incremental treadmill and an upper Wingate, throw in some pro boxers, you get a really interesting mix of things occurring that are just quite fascinating. But the upper one, yeah, I think now when they come in the lab, they look at the bike a bit of a fondness now, and they look at the hand crank with just severe hatred, because it's the most the most reluctant to do that. Even though they may have done back-to-back sessions for weeks, they still come in and they still look at that thing, and you can just see it. And it's just like, oh, I have to do this today. It is hard. It is a hard test. I blame John entirely for it. So
I mean, arm crank as a test is good, but arm crank as a training modality is really good.
yeah.
If you consider the upper body is predominantly type 2 fibers, how do you train endurance in the upper body? In combat sports, that's crucial, because if you've got 10, 12 rounds where you've got to keep your hands up, there's a high endurance component there that's not getting trained.
Exactly.
What's happening is boxers are dropping their hands and taking face shots that we shouldn't be taking. And what we know is that upper body Wingate's really good at improving type 2A mitochondrial content and type 2A oxidative capacity.
Yeah, so John, let's actually go into that. We have a few minutes left. So let's talk a little bit about the physiology behind those super maximal efforts. So from your research, from your experience, tell us what is going on under the hood with those sprints that is so beneficial for athletes.
So what's happening is you have a high motor unit recruitment, because you've got to create a lot of power to overcome the inertia of the wheel, which trains neuromuscular activation. So sprints have been shown to improve neuromuscular firing rate and calcium sensitivity at neuromuscular junction. So we've got a greater calcium sensitivity, which means we get a greater acetylcholine release. Because of that, we get a greater action potential. So we can create more cross bridges and create more power. So what we're training is muscular efficiency. That is key. That's the one thing that's overlooked. Big muscles aren't efficient muscles. What you want is muscular efficiency. That will create you with power. That will give you your endurance performance as well. So it's about training calcium sensitivity, and you get that with sprint interval training, which you don't get with resistance training. And sprint interval training does type 1 and type 2 fibers, whereas endurance training only targets type 1 fibers. So you're getting almost a crossover between the two of them, and you're getting muscular efficiency and mitochondrial biogenesis. So you get more mitochondria, more of your muscles battery, and more signal for ATP. And put that together, the training adaptation is improved performance, regardless of what the sport is, because that's underpinning principles of all sport: calcium sensitivity of the muscle and mitochondria to produce ATP.
Yeah, and that would make sense, targeting those type 2 fibers with those interval super maximal sprints, because we know the importance of capitalization and of mitochondrial density, and we talk about that in zone 2 training for endurance athletes, but we rarely talk about those crucial components as well for those high power sports, because you need more capillaries around your type 2 fibers. You need more mitochondria, even though they won't have as many compared to type 1. You still can develop those, and that kind of work is going to target that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the advantage of supramaximal over trying to control it is it's simple. All you have to tell the athlete is, I want you to go as hard as you can. So you're not trying to say, get up to this heart rate and stay there. It's simple. It's simplifying it down.
Yeah.
It makes it easier to do as a coach. It's like, just do this. Just go as hard as you can. I'll tell you when to stop.
And you're going to recruit everything under the sun, and then things are going to fatigue as you go along, and you're going to fatigue more and more of those motor units, and try to tap into as many things as possible. And you still have your type 1s that work for all the recycling that has to go into the lactate and all those things. So you kind of hit on everything. You talked about
the other advantage is you get the improvement in lactate utilization, which we haven't touched on at all. So if you think about it during the VO2 max test, that means that the point where your blood lactate starts to accumulate moves rightwards. So instead of having, let's say, 15 kilometers per hour, we can push that up to 18 kilometers per hour, which means the point of fatigue is changing. So the lactate handling is also a crucial adaptation that happens. So it's been shown to increase MCT1 and MCT4, both on the mitochondria and on the plasma membrane. So you get more lactate moving into the mitochondria of the muscle that's producing it to be used oxidatively, and you've got a greater clearance out to other tissues that are going to use it as well.
And that's from sprint interval training as well?
From sprint interval training, yeah.
Very, very interesting. I'll have to ping you back via email for that, because I want to dig into this. It's really interesting. Now, guys, you talked about, we have a handful of minutes left here. You talked about, everything that's left to be discovered in the repeat sprint or the sprint interval training realm. So if people are out there listening and maybe want to get into this type of research, what areas would you like to see studied in the future? Obviously you can't do all of it, so if you had to share the load a little bit, what would you like to see done in that realm of sprint interval training in terms of what should we test, what should we study in the future?
Let Andrew go first.
All right, thanks, John. For me, I think the localized effect, I think we do a lot more understanding oxygen utilization and kinetics. I think it's still in its infancy. I think Moxie's phenomenal, but I'm still wonder whether we need a bit more advanced technology for that. But I think where it's at, we can gather a lot there. I think point of view of timings of sprint sessions interests me a little bit, when we use them, how we use them. Does accumulated fatigue have an effect? Does it not have an effect? I think there's some areas around about that. A big area for me of interest is glycogen utilization, just how much glycogen is being used in the muscle tissue. I mean, we are, if anyone out there wants to donate some money towards a portable ultrasound, we are looking to do that. So that'd be one area as well. And then the big area for us that we will do is look at mitochondrial capacity and non-invasive ways to ascertain and measure that as well. So there's an absolute wealth. I'm pretty sure we would, Abertay University, be keen on potential new PhD candidates to look at some of these things. Shameless plug.
For me, the biggest area is recovery. How are sprints influencing recovery? What do we mean by recovery? Within and between competition recovery. In any sport, that recovery process is crucial. And we don't really understand what that process is. Mm-hmm. We know what we're looking at, but there might be more to it than just that. Yeah. So recovery is an underutilized modality in sports science. It's underlooked at in terms of training. Mm-hmm. So training for recovery is something that very few people look at. And I think it's something that really needs to be explored more fully.
Very, very interesting. All right, guys, we're getting to the end here. That was a lot of fun. Now I'm going to go and rethink what I've been doing on those Wingates, and I'm going to have to definitely shorten those rest intervals and actually, meet the savior. So that I'm really looking forward to that. Thanks, guys. Andrew, it's always a great pleasure to have you on. Thanks for coming back.
It's always a pleasure.
John, it was great to meet you, and thanks for sharing all those insights today. Guys, where can people find you online if they want to, get in touch, talk about research, or Andrew, if they're not happy with what you're saying, if they want to.
No more hate mail. So on Instagram, I think it's the Andrew Usher. On Twitter, the usual, and Facebook. That's it. I'm not prolific on socials, or they can email me at andrew@andrewusher.com. I can't remember what my university email address is. Is it some funky number like 210-5081 or something? And so I'm around. People can email me about anything really.
Fantastic. John?
My email's on the Abertay University website, John Babraj at abertay.ac.uk. I'm on Instagram, but like Andrew, I'm not prolific on social media. I'm of a generation that's missed it.
Well, the university page is linked, and if anybody wants to get in touch, they know how to do so. Thanks so much for coming on, guys.
Yep, thank you for having us. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you would like to support the podcast, please take a few moments to leave a written review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. If you want to watch this episode again, you can find the full video recording on my YouTube channel. You'll also find hundreds of hours of free content, all my podcasts, my thoughts of the day, structured presentations, and more. So don't wait, go subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.